Right, thank you very much to the Society for inviting me. So, as Bill, there will be a bit of the old tonight in terms of things we've done over the last 10 years, particularly the Rhynie project, and then we'll move on in the second half to look at a new site that we've been investigating at East Lomond in Fife. So, as a bit of background, we've been looking at early medieval Scotland in our two projects over the last 10 years or so. And the Picts were the early societies who ruled over eastern and northern Scotland. This is a map showing the extent of the kingdom around about 700 AD. But the Picts have always been a bit of an enigma due to the lack of historical sources we have for this group. So in the post-Roman period, we have things like the Life of Columba or the Irish Annals, which give us kind of snippets of information about the Picts. And what do these sources tell us? Well, they tell us about the elites within society. There were kings, some of the lineages involved in rulership. And they also tell us small details about where they ruled. So they refer to particular power centres, often hill forts, as one of the prime means of demonstrating power within northern Britain was the construction of these major centres. We see references to the burning and destruction of these centres. War and warfare is prominent in our sources. But the important thing to note is that most of our sources are 7th century or later, so they don't really shed any light on how this society began to form, and tells us very little about centralization or rulership in the earlier period. And this is where archaeology obviously comes to the fore. And indeed, the Picts are mentioned much earlier than the 7th centuries in Roman sources in the late 3rd century AD. And there's some suggestions in these Roman sources that there was some degree of centralization of power, or at least identity, in northern Britain in the late Roman period. So Cassius Dio, for example, talking about the Meatai and the Caledonii merging other earlier groups into these main polities. But in general, historians of the period have certainly shied away from any sort of idea of continuity between the late Roman period and the early medieval period. And that's something that we began to revisit really through the archaeology. So as mentioned, we've had two big projects running on early medieval Scotland and its wider context, Northern Picts and the Leverhulme project. And hopefully these maps will just show you give you an idea of the sort of impact we've been able to have through large-scale funding. So this was a map of northeast Scotland showing Pictish sites from around about 20, 25 years ago. And you see the dots in yellow are the actual archaeological sites. The dots in blue are the famous symbol stones. So a very sparse map in terms of settlements. And this is what we've been able to produce more recently for the monograph that will be published by the Society of Antiquaries. So not just our work, but lots of others contributing to this through aerial reconnaissance, through survey work, through lots of small-scale evaluations of sites, able to populate that map in a much more detailed level. That's not to say that there's still not huge amounts of progress we can do. We're still light years behind early medieval Ireland or England in terms of numbers of sites. But anyway, for the first part of the lecture, I'll take you back to the kind of the origins of the Northern Picts project and our work at the University of Aberdeen. And this refers to our work at Rhynie. And so in 1978, quite a remarkable stone was found. And this was a news report from a few years later.
Although 1,500 years old, he's showing no sign of age and is none the worse for spending most of his life buried in a field in Rhynie. Joan Ingram reports.
10 years ago, a farmer and his son were ploughing this field when they came across a large stone. Not in itself unusual, but this stone was special. It's a Pictish warrior stone. It was carved 1,500 years ago and showed a man wearing a tunic and pointed shoes. It's been called Rhynie Man and is a drawing of the earliest inhabitant of Grampian region. And it's in Grampian region's headquarters in Aberdeen, Rhynie Man is being displayed for all his descendants to see. Standing 6 feet tall, he's an imposing figure, complete with belted tunic, pointed shoes and fierce expression. However, these details weren't immediately obvious when he was found on Gavin Austin's farm by his son Kevin.
I was ploughing up in the hill there and I had a big stone. I managed to pull it out and just carried on ploughing.
Did you realise that there was anything special about it?
No, just thought it was another big stone.
What would you normally have done with it?
Well, we just plough them up and cart them off, bury them in a hole somewhere.
Experts think he must have fallen over soon after being carved, buried in soil and so saved from the ravages of time.
So that was the Grampian News 10 years after the discovery of stone. In fact, the stone stood outside Gavin Austin's farm for 10 years, which is quite remarkable to think about him coming out his front door to see the Rhynie Man standing there. So this was the event that kind of prompted our Northern Picts project really to be established. And the reason we were interested in Rhynie was because of all the Class 1 symbol stones that had been found there over the years, dating back in terms of discovery from the 19th century to the late 1970s. And when the Rhynie Man was discovered, Ian Shepherd and Ian Ralston took a series of aerial photographs of the location, revealing this settlement that was buried under the ground on this kind of really noticeable knoll just to the south of the village. And the other important piece of information in terms of our interest in the site was the place name work by Juliana Grieg and by Simon Taylor, noting the re element to the place name of Rhynie, suggesting this was a place associated with a great king. And Simon Taylor's quite happy that this is a Pictish or an earlier place name. So this was our first field endeavour in 2011 as part of the Rhynie Environs Archaeological Project, which was funded by the Society and by other small-scale funders. And over the years, we established that this settlement dated to this earlier Pictish period, enclosed by this really substantial series of earthworks, ditches, and presumably ramparts associated with that, and this really complex wooden enclosure, which was the kind of secondary phase to the site, with this really complex carpentry making up the outer palisade of this complex. And then a series of buildings inside this complex, which is remarkable in its own right, in terms of we have very few earth-fast structures from eastern Scotland in the Pictish period. And we also found a stone socket, which we think could have been for the Rhynie Man himself. And so both the crossdane and the Rhynie Man seems to have stood at the entranceway into this elite settlement. And this is what we think it might have looked like, with the buildings inside and the outer palisade, and then tapping off in the background there. What we also established was that there was a contemporary cemetery down by the village, and this is where some of the other Pictish stones have been found over the years, including the warrior carving, which seems to be standing next to a burial monument of some kind. And we also had these very large square enclosures, similar to the ones at Forteviot, the later Royal Pictish Centre, and a series of square barrows, including one which had a preserved Pictish individual within the grave there. We think this is an adult female. And the work of Professor Kate Britton and colleagues at Aberdeen have begun to look at this through isotopic research. And we think this is probably a local individual eating a terrestrial diet. But what was, I guess, most remarkable about the findings at Rhynie was the kind of continuity across this time period from the late Roman Iron Age to the early medieval. So the Crossdane complex seems to have emerged sometime in the mid-4th century AD and endured until roughly the kind of mid-6th century AD context. And then in the following years, after we finished excavating the Crossdane, we began to realize that what we had here was not just a singular site, but this whole multiple concentration of sites within the same landscape. And undoubtedly the most amazing of those is Tapanoth, this huge hill fort, 17 hectares in extent. And excavations there over the last few years has shown that the house platforms, there's about 800 of these, all the ones we've excavated, about 15 to 20 of these, all date to the same time period, from the late Roman period through to about the 6th or the 7th century AD in context. And this is a reconstruction drawing by Bob Marshall showing this settlement at its height. And again, here's the radiocarbon date showing that continuity, again, across the late Roman period through to the early medieval. And this site itself emerging sometime in the 3rd century, we think. So this was the first site in that landscape. And so, yeah, this seems to be part of this kind of multi-nodal central place complex with lots of different elite sites within the same landscape, very similar to what we find in Scandinavia in the first millennium AD context. And because of the kind of accuracy of Bayesian modeling and dating these days, we can actually trace the kind of evolution of this landscape. And the most important site seems to be Tapanoth in terms of this huge, large-scale settlement, providing the basis for this landscape to develop through time. So this large place of regional assembly or settlement, providing the foundations for this royal centre to emerge in the lowlands sometime in the 4th or 5th century AD context. And in terms of looking at the development of Tapanoth, it's quite interesting, this kind of 3rd century context is when we have much less evidence for direct Roman intervention in the far north, both in Scotland, and we also know in the 3rd century across the empire, this is a time in which there were less campaigns against these rebellious barbarian groups. So it might be that this lack of Roman activity in the north is giving, again, the foundations, the opportunity for consolidation of some of these groups to emerge. So Tapanoth emerging a few generations after the last major Roman campaigns north of the Forth. And the Crossdane complex really beginning to take hold in the 4th century until the mid-6th century. And the place name evidence and the kind of material culture, which I'll come on to in a minute, really suggests that this was the highest level of elite site in this time period. So it was this emergence of this site really marks an important step, I think, in the rise to power of particular individuals, particular lineages that controlled the Upper Strathbogie Valley and presumably a much larger territory beyond that. And one important dimension of this site, I think, is undoubtedly as a place of cult and ritual. and in the monograph we will go into much more detail about that and about this whole theoretical context for the development of the site. But let's have a look at some of the finds we made at this site. And this is really thanks to the work by Gemma Cruikshanks in particular, and a whole series of colleagues listed there. And despite the fact that we only excavated around about 10% of the Crossdale complex, a very small percentage of Tapa North, we had a very, very large finds assemblage, including some of the most significant metalworking evidence we have for the early medieval period. And in terms of metalworking, we can see from the historical sources from Scotland and elsewhere how really central metalworking and metalwork production was in terms of supporting an elite. So in a Germanic context, kings were known as the givers of rings or the breaker of treasure. And it was treasure that they were producing at the Crossdale complex. So we got hundreds of ceramic crucibles, and we've got silver working waste. But I think probably the most amazing objects are these, which don't look like much, but they're little stone vessels. And Gemma, with some amazing detective work, has worked out that these are probably silver refining vessels, cupels. So they were adding lead to the silver to refine it, using Roman sources of silver to create a purer silver for trade and for production of fancy objects. And so just to highlight a few of those examples tonight, so we've got about 400 mould fragments from this very small percentage of this plough truncated site. For example, they're producing hand pins. Rhynie now has 50% of the production evidence for these objects in the whole of Scotland. And we can clearly see this is bespoke production. There's no one of these handpin molds are the same. So they're producing objects at a bespoke level. We also have these amazing molds for making animal figurines, and we've got 16 different examples of these. And we don't know of any similar examples anywhere from Britain or Ireland. And they were producing little figurines that are the animals of the hunt. And you may know that the hunt imagery is so important in Pictish art in a later time period. So this seems like a kind of foundational element of that imagery within Pictish art. So they're making little figurines that include wild boar, hounds or wolves, and we see all these animals on the early Pictish carvings. And also this example, which might be either a bear or a badger, depending on who you listen to, me or Gemma. And again, we find the bear represented in Pictish art, both on symbol stones and on later early Christian art. What these are for is highly debatable. So Gemma's looked at various possible possibilities, where they crest to helmets. And we've actually, working with an artist at Edinburgh College, Jennifer Gray, we got these molds 3D scanned, and we created a reversal, and Jennifer cast out some of these animals, and you can see how beautiful they are. They're animals in motion. But they don't seem to have any attachments, so they might not be for helmets. They could just be figurines for gaming or amulets of some kind. And there was a whole other series of other crafts going on site. There's these tiny glass rods, which might be for bead making or for insetting enamel onto some of the metal objects that were being created there. There's a small assemblage of spindle whorls for spinning yarn. And there's also the production tools as well. And here we see evidence of a kind of ritualized end to this site. So these tongs were found deliberately deposited in a postal upright rammed into a setting that included a huge number of animal bones. It seems to be in a kind of deliberate dismantling of the site at the end of its life. We've also got very significant evidence for high quality blacksmithing. So we've got this pattern welded knife, which resembles the kind of seax type of blades you get in high status Anglo-Saxon burials. And this is first evidence we've got of pattern welding in early medieval Scotland. And we also have bits and pieces of weaponry. So that's a blade, and we've got this copper alloy pommel, which never seems to have been used. It looks like they're actually producing weaponry on site. And then this is a tiny little face we found, which only after conservation did we realize that there was this image inscribed on it, which appears to be the face of a Pict, perhaps. So we've got this kind of curly hair and the kind of oval-shaped eyes that you see on Pictish sculpture. So whether this was some sort of shield attachment or, again, some sort of amulet, we're not quite sure. Now, there's lots of evidence for these long-distance connections. And again, that goes back into the Roman period. So we've got Nene Valley ware appearing on some of the platforms at Tappanoth. And in the post-Roman period, we've got these late Roman amphora vessels. And we've got 89 shares of this, which is at least 4 vessels, which doesn't sound very much, but when you think about elsewhere in Scotland, we've only got 2 vessels from Dumbarton, 1 from Whithorn, and 1 from Iona. So despite this being the most northerly example of the currents of this material, we've got very significant amounts of this. Again, from the site we've only dug a very small percentage of. We've got evidence for wine drinking. So we've got these glass vessels coming from Anglo-Saxon England and from Western France. But we've also got, I think, quite unimpressive in terms of to look at objects, but I think equally exciting in terms of thinking about the significance of this assemblage. So we've got handmade pottery from Rhynie and from Tappanoth, and we didn't know there was a local potting tradition in this time period. And we've had Shailin Prado, researcher working on plant remains, looking at the contents of these pots, and they seem to be for storing and for cooking barley. So again, it gives you a glimpse of the kind of everyday practices and lifestyles of the people living at Rhynie. And that also extends to things like grinding stones, and we also have these polished stone discs from Rhynie and from Tappanoth, which are thought to be for chopping up medicines or makeup. So again, these little personal touches, gaming pieces. But to kind of sum all this up, and this is again Gemma's work, there's no other site in Scotland of this time period, 4th to 6th century, with this range of material. And in order to find parallels, Gemma's had to cast her net that bit wider, looking at garans in Ireland. In Ireland, in this time period, we've got this amazing glut of historical sources that tells us that this site, Garans, was an early royal centre in this region of Southern Ireland. And the material assemblage is very, very similar. So late Roman amphora, production evidence, the refining of silver also happening at the site. And so the parallels here really emphasize the kind of status and significance of what we were getting at Rhynie. Right, so that's a bit of the old. Now let's move on and think about what we've been doing a bit more recently. So the big question that we began to ask ourselves, when we'd found Rhynie was, is this a one-off? Is there other sites like this in what became Pictland, so the areas north of the Forth. And so we began to work in the last couple of years with the Falkland Trust and with Joe Fitz in particular, looking at this amazing site here at East Lomond. And so what we have here on top of the hill is something a bit different, probably, in terms of its later history. So, or at least we presume so, because it's never actually been excavated. So on the top, we have this hill fort that morphologically we would put a decent amount of money on, this being 7th, 8th, 9th century AD in date. So one of these kind of nuclear complex multi-rampart forts. But the early work by the Trust and by Ollie Grady found this lower annex. So just to the south of the main hill here, you can maybe just see that platform on the LiDAR results down there. And geophysical surveys showed that this was enclosed by a rampart, and there was a whole series of remains within. And the early projects, which were 2014, 17, and 19, began to produce quite significant material. And that included, again, late Roman material, so things like beads, pottery, metalwork, but also settlement evidence that really resembles what we were getting on Tapanoff. So these multiple occupations, hearths built upon one another, incredibly dense settlement within this southern annex enclosure. This is a close-up of this lovely projecting headed pin from some of the early phases at East Lomond. And again, lots of evidence for contact with the Roman world, although again, this is in an area that's far removed from the frontier by this time. So exactly the same type of material that's turning up at Tapanoff, so Neen Valley ware, but also other pottery like Oxfordshire ware as well. There's 4th century Roman coin from the hill as well, suggesting again a society, a settlement that's in contact with these other places. And that continues again into the post-Roman context. So this was reported from the 2014 finds, I think, was a single sherd of Eware pottery. So this is material that's coming from Western France, usually thought to hold exotic foodstuffs or dyes or significant material that's coming in via the kind of Gaulish trade routes up the west coast of Scotland, and only a handful of sites receiving this material in the late 6th or early 7th century AD context. And just a few months back, we were able to get a hold of the finds from those early excavations after the untimely death of Oliver O'Grady. And in that assemblage was a bag that was labelled medieval jug handle. And I took this out of the bag and I was like, well, I've seen that before. And it's a handle of a late Roman amphora. So again, this is the stuff that's coming from the Eastern Mediterranean all the way to Scotland in the 5th or early 6th century AD context. So now this is yet another site, only the second site in the whole of Eastern Britain that has this late Roman amphora. Just a single sherd so far, but it certainly suggests, again, a very, very significant site at East Lomond in both the 5th and 6th centuries and through to the 7th century in this context. And so over the last couple of years, since we began working with Joe Fitz and the Trust, we began to build on the work of those early seasons. So in 2022 and 2023, we focused on the rampart of this annex enclosure. And you can see our trench on the right there of last summer, giving you an idea of the kind of topography. This is one of the windiest locations in Scotland, but an amazing archaeological site. And again, this will give you a flavour of the kind of things we're finding at East Lomond. It's very, very similar to Tapanoff in terms of the density of settlement remains. So just multiple hearths from multiple late Roman through to Pictish buildings built one on top of another. Really quite remarkable. And again, finding quite significant materials, so things like metalworking evidence, gaming counters, pottery, all these imports arriving at the site. And this was us last summer. It was meant to be 25 degrees for the 10 days that we were working. It felt like it was 9 degrees or -9, I'm not quite sure. But our amazing volunteers and some Aberdeen students as well worked together to uncover probably the most detailed sequence we've got yet from East Lomond. So there's almost 1/2 metre of deposits. And within a 10 by 10 metre trench, we had something like 18 hearths. So that would have been 18 buildings built over time within that sequence. And again, it goes from the late Roman period through to the 6th or 7th century. And we just got a whole series of radiocarbon dates back from that, sponsored by Historic Environment Scotland. And some great finds again from last summer. This is our Aberdeen students on the right-hand side here. Wowed by the number of finds bags we were very carefully curating on the kitchen floor there. A grinding stone on the left-hand side. And some really quite exciting finds came up last summer as well. So this looks like the doorknob from a door. It's actually a spear butt, and it's one of these very, very rarely attested forms, the doorknob spear butts, which dates to this kind of, again, late Roman through to 5th, 6th century context. So this was found in the kind of middle layers of the settlement sequence. And it resembles the base of the spears which you find on the warrior carvings that are located in eastern Scotland. So there's Rhynie, there's Colessi, there's Tulloch warrior, and they're all carrying these really distinctive spears that have these doorknob spear butts there. I can maybe just make out in the photogrammetry model on the left-hand side. What's remarkable about going through the earlier finds from the excavation and from our finds is just the amount of spear butts we have from the site. So weaponry is very rarely attested in these late antique sites. You know, there's some examples from sites like Traprain Law. There's molds for making doorknob spear butts in places like the Western Isles and the Northern Isles, but the actual objects very rarely turn up. But we've now got about 4 or 5 of these conical spear butts. We've got the doorknob one as well. And so again, it attests to the presence of warriors at this location. So how do we begin to contextualize East Lomond? Well, I think we're beginning to see many of the same elements we see at Rhynie and Tapanoff on this site. We've got sculpture and power. We've got this carving of a bull that's been recorded from East Lomond. There's Class 1 Pictish stones from East Lomond just below the hill itself. And we see this kind of major hilltop settlement overlooking this large productive lowlands, and I'll talk more about some of the sites down below. And we've got the material trappings of warriors through the material culture. We've got this sense of settlement centralization, just in terms of the density of settlement that we've got there. And again, we've got no gap between this late Roman and early medieval sequence. So again, the sequence goes from the 3rd century through to the early 7th century, and almost directly maps on to the chronology we now have from Tapanoff. In fact, this is a Bayesian model showing the start dates for Tapanoff and East Lomond, and you can see they almost directly map onto one another, with the most likely start date being again in that mid to late 3rd century context. So again, in this time period in which we have less direct Roman intervention in the far north. So we've got at Tapanoth and Rhynie, we've got this major hill fort overlooking this productive lowlands and this royal centre down the lowlands. Is there anything similar at East Lomond? Well, we've certainly got a number of Pictish stones that come from Falkland and the environs round about. We've got these amazing timber halls or settlements at Lathrisk, just a stone's throw away from Falkland. And we've got a whole series of quite amazing sites in the parish of Falkland and the next parish, which is Kettlebridge. So we've got this site at Cash Mill, which looks like a dead ringer for an Irish wrath. It's quite amazing. We really need to go do some work at this site. And then we've got this incredible barrow cemetery at Kettlebridge, which has some of the largest barrows known from the whole of Pictland. So it's huge circular enclosures, very large square barrows, and some of the smaller square barrows as well. And what's, beginning to map some of this evidence, what kind of struck me is that just how important this kind of western part of the How of Fife seems to be. So here's Falkland mapped in red here, and the red dots are the Class 1 symbol stones from Fife. And you can see there's a very peculiar distribution of symbol stones from Fife. They're almost exclusively concentrated on this western part of the How and the valleys going up towards Clatcher Craig and Abernethy. So do we have the kind of heartlands of the kingdom of Fife located in this area around about Falkland and Kettlebridge? And indeed, if we look at some of the later sources, we can see that Falkland and Kettle were 2 of the 4 thanages of Fife. Formerly, thanages were interpreted as kind of royal land, and our picture of thanages is a bit more complex now. But they certainly, we can still say that thanages are significant territories within the developing kingdom of Alba and Scotland. And so I don't think it's any coincidence that 2 of these are concentrated in this western part of the How again. And then another potential significant location is Colessie, which has got this Laos place name element, which would also suggest some form of early centre. And the place name evidence suggests that this might have been a subordinate part of Kettle in this location. So again, it's all suggesting that this western part of the How is really significant both in the Pictish period and in the period of the 9th to the 12th century AD. So, how can we sum all that up? Well, you'll have to read the book for Rhynie, which hopefully will be out by the end of the year or early next year. And we go into much more detail about these arguments, so being quite schematic tonight, but take my word for it that we justify some of these statements more clearly in the monograph. So in conclusion, really, I think we can see that it's not till the late 6th century, in terms of documentary sources, that we have a Pictish king confirmed in multiple sources. But I think we can certainly trace back rulership and centralization into a much earlier time period, and probably into the late Roman period. So that comments of Dio talking about the centralization or this amalgamation of polities around about 200 AD is quite significant, I think. And he also says how martial ability appears to be a major determinant of who ruled the peoples north of the Hadrianic frontier. And certainly at Rhynie, and I think now East Lomond, we've got the kind of material evidence of these kind of warrior kingships being a strong part of the kind of material culture of these sites from at least the 4th century AD onwards. And in the monograph, we talk about this kind of change of forms of rulership in Britain more generally. So James Gerard, for areas further south, is suggested in the post-Roman period, you get this kind of shift to a form of leadership backed by the point of a sword as civilian and military rule in Roman Britain begins to disintegrate. I think if we think about the kind of military zone that existed in the northern frontier, I think that idea of leadership backed by the point of a sword is likely to have emerged earlier rather than later in the north. And I think that's what we might be seeing in action when we begin to look at these sites like Rhynie and East Lomond, where we see clear evidence for centralization of settlement. We see warriorhood and the trappings of an emerging royal elite in the time period of the 4th to the early 7th century AD, i.e. before our historical sources really begin to come online. So, thank you very much for listening. A lot of the work that we've done over the last 10 years has been funded by the public, either through direct donations or through grants from public bodies. So we're very grateful to the people who have supported the project in the past. We've got a fundraising page. And we also have a merch range modelled by myself up here. This is one of the more niche designs, I must say. But all the money that we get from Northern Picts merch also goes to the project. And we also have a book as well. There's a new edition coming out from Berlin in April, I think it is. So please buy yourself a copy of that if you haven't already. And please follow us on Facebook and X and Blue Sky and the like. But anyway, thank you very much for listening.